Yes, hi and welcome to this session called Navigating Agile Waters. And what I will be talking about here is basically distributed agile software projects, how to set them up and sort of mechanics around these projects and the insights that I have come to sort of value here during my past two decades working in IT. Who will be speaking here is, as I said, my name is Christoffer, and I have 20 years working in IT, 7 years as a developer, mainly working in .NET and C++, and then 13 years working as a project manager, product owner, and also working with developing agile methodologies. Much of that work was in the ERP space, but I also worked extensively in the defense domain and also worked a lot with other types of domains such as healthcare, solutions for recruitment, and so on. And almost all these projects have actually been distributed in some way that either that they have a key stakeholder somewhere else that I have been sitting, or that we have had distributed development teams. To start out this session, I would like to sort of be honest in saying I haven't been running my perfect project yet. There is always learnings to make and always adjustments that you can make going forward when you start new projects. And there are always different things to do things than the ones that I propose here to do here today. But with that, as I said, I've been working with this for almost 2 decades. I have made some learnings, and my hope here is, of course, that I will share some of the things here today that you will be able to sort of see value of, to bring into and reflect over in your daily work and in the projects that you work in. The intended audience for this presentation is primarily people that might have been working a few years in an Agile or a Scrum setup. It's not an introduction to Scrum. It's more that you should have some knowledge of the basic concepts to get the most value out of this presentation. But of course, anybody is of course welcome to listen in. Outline for the presentation is as follows. I'll start with going through some principles, some things that I always have in the back of my head when I start up a collaboration, which I think is important to consider and be aware of however you set up your sort of project setup, that to have these principles as a guiding light, so to say, and to reflect over. Then the second part of this presentation, it's mechanics and execution. Then getting into a little bit the nitty-gritty details. Okay, if we have these principles, how do you actually ensure that those materialize in the project? What project structure, meeting structure, and things to consider more sort of hands-on. Third, I'll go through some pitfalls. There are things that I have seen over and over again when working in software projects that I think it's good to be mindful of to avoid and to sort of ensure that you have a successful collaboration and an efficient project that you're working in. And in the end of this meeting, we will also have a Q&A session where anybody can sort of ask any questions you might have related to this topic. And as we are quite a few in this meeting today, I kindly ask you to hold your questions until we get to the Q&A session in the end. Also worth mentioning is that the things that I will go through here today, the focus here is distributed project management with sort of agile project management. But of course, some of the things that are important in a distributed project is also important in any agile project. But I will try to highlight a bit when I come to the stuff where I think this is really key to consider when working distributed. So, without further ado, let's get started and talk about the principles. So, what makes an agile project efficient? Fortunately, for many of us, we don't have to guess on this because Google, they ran a project back in 2012 called Project Aristotle, where they surveyed 180 teams for a period of 2 years, and they sort of investigated what actually makes a team efficient and perform well. And in top of those priority or of the findings from that project was that psychological safety is very important. Team members must be comfortable in taking risks and speak their minds. If there is something that they feel that they do not understand, that needs to be raised. If there is any risk that any person in the team sees, it's important that that person does not sit for any sort of reason that they don't dare to speak up, rather that they speak their minds. And also the same with improvement suggestions, of course, that everybody feels that they can contribute of making the solution better. This is what Google came up with as the sort of primary sort of factor for making a team efficient. Next up, after that, they identified dependability. And that means that you can depend on that your colleagues, they do their job. If you say that you are to do something within a given time limit, that you actually honor those commitments. And with dependability, my own take here a little bit also that it comes to that you have to know what others are doing. It has to be clear who is doing what and when they are doing it and so on, and facilitating handovers or so in a good way, so that, as I said, people in the team can depend on each other and know what others are doing. Third, structure and clarity. It's important that everybody in the team knows what part they play and that everybody in the team also understand how they should go about to get the job done. My personal add-on to this one would be then that I also see an importance of that we have a backlog, we have a plan for what needs to be done, in which order things should be executed, and that's clear and well known and well communicated for everybody. If you haven't read about Project Aristotle, I strongly recommend you to have a look at that project separately and go through the sort of the findings of that project, because there are a lot of valuable sort of insights came out of that project. But I'll stop with these top 3 items, which I think is very important to consider for this slide. And then I'll move on to the next sort of picture I have in the back of my head when setting up a project collaboration. And what this picture should visualize is basically that the faster you can find the bug in a software development process, the cheaper it will be. And the cheapest bug is the one that doesn't occur in the first place. That's the absolute cheapest one to fix and address. But looking through this graph, then, if you find something in the requirements, then it's really cheap to fix that problem. And if you turn that discussion around and saying that if you do not get your requirements right, if you do not solve the business problem that your customer or your customer's customer really have, it doesn't really sort of matter if you have the best, fanciest technical solution to it. Because if you don't solve the business problem, it will anyway be useless when it's time to get it into production, because it doesn't solve the problem that you're paid to solve. Continuing then to the right in this graph, if a bug can be found by the developer, her or himself, that you directly ensure that the product have sufficient tools, sufficient test data, sufficient test environments, so that it's easy for developers to find issues before they are sort of committed into the main branch and being tested by an internal tester. That's the sort of the second best. If you find it by QA personnel or internal testers while actually developing, it still carries a quite low cost. But what you really would like to avoid is that you don't want to have bugs in production, because if you go all the way to production, you normally have a lot of handovers. The bug has to be raised by the customer to your support personnel. That has to be raised internally, perhaps being assigned to a developer. That whole chain has to backtrack. Perhaps you have to make a new release, which often require quite huge cost. And not the least to consider the fact that if you have a malfunctioning system, you might lose customer altogether because they feel to go with some other competitor of yours. So avoiding bugs in production to sort of increase efficiency. That's key. Third, which also is something that I have in the back of my head and which I consider a lot when sort of setting up project collaborations, is to reduce context switching, meaning that it's really harmful for many of us when we sit and sort of do emails or create PowerPoints or do other administrative items, that when you do context switch too much, that actually causes you to lose productivity. But when you do something as complex as software development, you have to sort of build your whole cache memory. You have to see how your code affects other parts of the code and code that others have developed. If you have to switch context frequently, there is a point, and my sort of learning from this is that this point comes sooner than many of us think, that you actually you spend majority of your time context switching and not actually producing something. So ensuring that there isn't too much things going on at the same time, that what you start, you actually finalize that, get that out to production and get business revenue from that, that has a huge value. I also believe that you have a sort of a multiplying factor here. If you are in an organization and you have a development item and you need to check that off with your key stakeholders, you have to have internal meetings, etc. And you in that context switch task a lot. There is an overhead of communication and meetings and sort of additional time that sort of adds to the cost of context switching in a project too often. So try to sort of reduce the things that are ongoing at the same time and ensure that you keep focused. That's something that I try to do in the projects that I work in to sort of ensure that we keep an efficient collaboration. So those were the sort of the main principles that I consider: the Project Aristotle ones, the psychological safety, dependability, structure and clarity, ensuring that we fix things early on, that we don't allow issues and bugs to arise early on in the software development process, rather trying to focus to have a decent quality, and also reduce context switching. So how to do this on a sort of in a more practical way then it's time for the next section of this presentation, which is the sort of mechanics and execution part. And if we start with the sort of the actual way of defining requirements, what I have come to value is that requirements, they originate from the business needs. That you try to avoid the kind of, okay, we need a new database here, or this UI doesn't look that nice, should we rewrite it? That you try not to originate from that, rather that you more have the focus, okay, here we have the business goals. We see that, for instance, we have a system that delivers functionality for accountants. We see that we can sell more or we can retain better if we can give this and this functionality for our accountant, so that you connect your requirements to sort of thoroughly to your business needs. And from that, you continue. And this format here that I'm advocating for, it's something that I think it's known to many of you that has been working with Scrum or Agile practices in the past, that you have this format that for some sort of end user, I would like the system to do this in order to get this capability. And why is this format good? Why do I prefer this form to use this format for setting the requirements? It creates a good handover layer between business stakeholders and the development team, by that the business can understand this. They can actually say, okay, this is why we're paying money. This is the problem we want to have solved, and it is for these user groups. And it's easy to have a discussion with business stakeholders. Okay, on this format, this is what we should aim for from a business perspective. It also facilitates that developers that work in the project, they understand what the system is going to be used for. And my experience is that that leads to less misunderstandings and higher quality and better discussions, because then the developers can question if there isn't a better solution, or if we can do any other way, or come with sort of good follow-up questions to sort of the development that is going to be undertaken. Sometimes I get the question if I think it's a good idea to split up user stories in back-end user stories and front-end user stories. And my sort of preference here is not to do that, rather to keep it together and deliver one business functionality, or at least an elevated business part of a functionality that sort of can be tested separately, and then you continue with the next thing, meaning that you do some little part, mobile app and or the front end together with the back end, so that you don't deliver just the back end or the front end, because then you actually haven't delivered any business value. But that is no contradiction to breaking down requirements in a good way. On the contrary, that's something you should do. That you, once you get going with your development, you should know that this is what we need to do in the back end. This is what we need to do in the front end. These are the scripts we need to produce, etc., etc. So it's very clear what should be achieved also from a technical standpoint. Then next slide is about prioritization and absolute priority. Something that I have come to value is that you keep the entire backlog, everything that needs to be done, in one single absolute prioritized list. And the main benefit I see here with this is that it becomes painfully clear that if something goes up in priority, something goes down in priority. This makes it very, very clear for the development team that this is what we need to focus on, and that way sort of getting back to sort of avoiding the context switching and so on. That makes it efficient for the team to execute on the backlog. It also puts some pressure on the business stakeholder to really sort of decide, okay, this is the most important thing we need to fix, and other things needs to wait. That is what I see as a much more honest discussion, rather to say that we have a release on the 20th of September and here we have 20 things that is must. That list, I mean, it can be easily extended to 30 things that is a must, or 40 things that is a must. By using an absolute priority, it forces stakeholder to actually say, okay, yeah, but if we only can do 10 items, which items is it really that should be sort of addressed? Also, when it comes to absolute priority, I'm an advocate of having not too many separate systems. For instance, for bugs, to have a priority, severity, criticality, all of that, if you would like to have it for follow-up reasons or signing SLAs or something like that, could very well be used. But from an execution standpoint, my preference is to get this into the same priority order as the development items. If a bug is important, then it should be high up in the list. Otherwise, it can wait. As you can understand from my previous reasoning here, I'm very much I'm pro having high quality in the solutions that is being developed. But it's not always the case that all the bugs can take priority over user stories as I see it, because sometimes they can actually be so that some user stories adds value that is more important than fixing some minor issue in the UI or something like that. Then when you sort of have your absolute priority, you have sort of set a list, then and one other thing that is especially important when working in distributed development is that you have a good issue tracking system that you use in your project. I have worked a lot with Jira and Azure DevOps, and I find that they work very well, but I'm sure there are other similar systems that does a really good job as well, keeping track of what needs to be done. And especially, as I said, when working distributed, it's really, really important to both have a good issue management system from a technical standpoint, but that everybody also is very disciplined on updating the issues so that everybody else knows what others are working on. Getting back to the principle of dependability, if you know what others are doing, it's easy to understand, okay, you see that this is a small bug and we have somebody that works on that. Then I can plan my work because I know that will be fixed in a day or two. Also, having an issue management system facilitates that you have efficient handovers. One sort of handover that you get back to that usually causes a bit of problems from time to time is the handover between developers and the testers. So that it's by having an issue management system and saying that an issue should have been moved over to in test or ready for testing or whatever the status might be, and it should be assigned to the relevant tester. That makes it very, very efficient. Okay, now the tester know that this can be tested and sort of start working with that, rather than to having continuous discussions on what sort of needs to be forwarded in the pipeline from sort of developers to testers. Once again, I would like to highlight the fact here that it's very important that it's not the project manager or the scrum master that takes the responsibility to ensure that the issue tracking systems is kept up to date. It's really important that everybody in the team takes this responsibility and ensure that they do not start on any work before they actually have assigned a task to them and put it to active and so on. And all through the cycle there, that everybody takes the responsibility of ensuring that the issue tracking is up to date to be able to work efficiently together. So that's a little bit general on the project development, but then sort of take it from the scratch then, how to get started with an Agile project and sort of how to think around deliveries. And my take on that is that if you just there was sort of a misconception especially when Agile was sort of being adopted in a lot of organization, that Agile means that, you just get going, you have some sort of problem, and then you're super Agile, you just start developing and you see a little bit where it ends up. The problem with that approach, because I've tried it some projects a long time back, and it's that those projects tend to be very, very expensive projects because you have to do a lot of learnings the hard way. So I would recommend that you start your projects with an inception period. I call it iteration 0. You can call it project inception or something similar. But basically that you take some time in the beginning of a project where you iterate requirements with your business stakeholder, where you go through design and key sort of architects and senior developers. They go through the technical architecture. You let UI designers go in and do mock UIs, or at least have a high level understanding of how the user interface or your mobile app will look like. And you iterate a bit back and forth during this period to ensure that once you get started with the actual development, you actually have a fairly good idea of what you will be doing. Then you should accept the fact that will change, but starting out with planning the project well usually pays off, give good dividends. When it comes to actually sort of delivering functionality, then I would advocate for the use of milestones, that you package the things that you do in not too big chunks, rather that you see, okay, what are the most valuable things that we can deliver fast to our customers? And then you see that, okay, now we have a feasible amount that we can deliver, and then you try to get that out in production, because this way you don't have a warehouse of software which you haven't earned any money on yet. And you also reduce a lot of risk. You reduce the risk of that the customer actually doesn't like what you're doing. You can get feedback, but you also reduces technical risks. For instance, that if you work for a very long time and nobody has tested your code in actual production during actual production circumstances, that over time carries a risk of that you have low quality as well. Then from time to time, it can actually make sense that you take another of these iteration 0, that everybody, your architects and UI designers and business stakeholders sit together and actually, go through the backlog. It could be that you have a new strategic decision within the company, or that you realize, okay, now we actually, we have something really complex we need to do. We need to sit down and, discuss this. We cannot just keep going incrementally. We need to pause here and take another period to discuss this from a sort of more holistic way. When working distributed, then I would recommend that if you have a travel budget, please use that travel budget during this iteration 0. If you in the beginning of the project can sit together in one room, it's usually really, really valuable and helps building both the team spirit. It becomes nicer to work in the project, but it's also really efficient from a pure execution standpoint. So then the sort of the project is going, and then it's sort of time to execute on the backlog. And the structure for executing in the projects that I'm working in usually looks something like that. They're working with a sort of a scrumish approach, often with 2-week sprints. And if you are a sort of a known practicer of Scrum or Agile, then you would see here, but hold on a minute, here there is no backlog grooming meeting here, and shouldn't the daily meetings be daily, and where are the retrospective? And my take here is that I often use a scrumish approach, but I see Scrum not as a sort of a religion that has to be followed strictly. You always have different considerations that you need to sort of do to sort of adapt the structure a little bit. And that I think it's perfectly okay to do so. You should adapt it so that it actually tailors the best way to what you are actually building right now, the context that you're executing on right now. And one thing, though, which I think is key for a successful project, is that you have your sprint reviews, and that is the meetings where you continuously sync with your customer to get that the customer can see the product that is being developed, they get a chance to input and comment on what's being developed, and that you have the ability to adjust slightly to ensure that you give the maximum sort of value back to your customers, and they get the sort of an elevated understanding of what actually is coming here in a 2 months or 3 months period. As mentioned, retrospectives, it's not part of this picture, and my sort of take on retrospective is that they carry a huge value, but I've come to sort of realize that it's not something that is needed after every sprint. If you have a major performance killer, you don't need a retrospective to sort of discuss, okay, this is not working well, this is something we should address. That you should do always. But when it comes to the formal retrospectives, they carry huge value as I see it. But it could very well be, for instance, that you take them after every milestone. If you have a milestone after 1.5 months, then it could be better to gather all the sort of thoughts that has and discuss what has happened during those 1.5 months, rather having it every 2 weeks, because it then might be that there isn't that much new things coming after a while. However, when it comes to retrospectives, I think it's important to work with them in such a way that you funnel them continuously. Basically, that you start with a data gathering phase where you basically see, okay, this is the things we did, or this is all the things we possibly can improve on. That you have sort of build the big gross list of items that you could discuss. Then you select few of those for deeper analysis. Okay, here we had the big problem with the build pipeline, or customer was really unhappy with translations. That you single out few of these, and then you get drilled into great details. Okay, this is what we should be discussing more. And then in the end of the day, you select these 2-3 perhaps things that is really matters that you execute on, and then you prioritize to actually do something about them, and that you ensure that you follow up. This in sort of comparison, rather to create a list of hundreds of items and say this is what we should be doing something about, because my experience is that you will, since you have a lot of ongoing development and a customer that wants functional deliveries from you as well, you will not have time to execute on too many items. So it's important to sort of funnel them down a bit and focus on what really, really matters. Then we are over in the pitfalls section, things that I think you should be a bit cautious about, or things that I think it's good that you avoid to have a good, efficient, successful collaboration. If you read what's on the screen right now, then a vehicle with plenty of horsepower. One main difference from other type of vehicles, it's the speed of which it operates. Vehicle have only space for one person, and a famous supplier of these vehicles usually deliver them in red color. You might be tempted to think that this is a race car that I'm describing, but in this case, it was actually a tractor. And with this example, I would like to sort of showcase that you should always be a bit skeptical to that the written word can convey exactly what you want to have done and exactly what you mean to another person. I've seen a number of really good analytical, high-performing developers that are sort of they prefer textual communication, and it's really good if everything is written to a detail in a user story, and that you have a specification that sort of into very great depth describes exactly what needs to be done. And also when it comes to sort of synchronizing the daily work, that you tend to send chat messages or emails a lot. And I would state that there is a risk with that. I would encourage that when there are things, for instance, if you start working in a sprint, you need to discuss with each other, you need to ask questions, you need to interact. And when you're syncing between developers and between business stakeholders, use Teams, for instance, is an excellent tool to call each other and share screen. And, okay, I'm thinking like this, the design looks like this. Can I get some feedback, rather than resort to too much textual communication? And once again, this is especially common, I would say, in distributed development, that there's too much sort of reliance on textual communication. Second pitfall to highlight, as I mentioned, I think it's a huge problem or a huge performance killer with context switching. And what I've seen also, despite that, time and time again, is that when you have a project and you have a lot of different things in that project, that could be enough actually to lower a person's productivity quite a lot. But if you, in addition to that, split persons up, so saying that Monday you should work 20% in this project and Tuesday 20% in that project, etc., etc., that kind of splitting up persons into different projects on a sort of regular basis, it's something that I think greatly sort of reduces the ability for that person to perform. And I know that there are some business contexts that really call for that at times, but the more it can be avoided, the better, I think, to assign, especially developers, to several different projects at the same time. So we are nearing the end of this presentation, but last and definitely not least, the sort of the last pitfall I would like to sort of highlight and go through is that it seems to be a norm in development that what you do is that you purchase projects using fixed price. Basically, you say that you will have a locked scope and you will have that for a fixed price within a fixed time. And the problem with that, as I see it, is that it's really, really hard to nail down requirements for a software project to the level that it actually makes sense to actually have a fixed price contract on it. There are so many ifs and buts to it, and if you do it like that, did you consider performance? Did you consider how that should look on an iPhone? Did you consider how that should look on an Android phone, etc., etc.? So it's really, really complex to set requirements for a software project to begin with. And should you set them to the extent you actually can, in a good way, lock a fixed price to a development project, then you have to spend a lot of time refining your requirements, almost as long in some cases as it would take to execute on the actual project. And also, as I mentioned, I see it as hugely valuable that you have these sprint reviews, that you from time to time sync with your customers, saying that this is actually what we want to have delivered. And at those occasions, you would like to have the ability that the customer, that both as a customer and as a developer, the customer says, well, if you just added this little button or this extra information, then it would add so much more value to our end customer. Then, of course, you would like to adhere to that and honor those input while your project is going. You don't want to take the huge process of a change request or an additional order of development or anything like that. So if you are to run really good projects, my take is that you should avoid having them as fixed price projects, because you would like to have the flexibility to do it. Also, to be clear on that, I don't say that or expect that a sort of a supplier should go to the or a customer should go to a supplier and say, oh, here's a big of money, deliver whatever you want. Not at all. For taking business decisions, you need to know if this is a 3 months project or a 6 months project or a 1 year project. But within that, it's better, and you should have an estimate, but that 3 months project might be a 3.5 months project or a 2.5 months project if you can live without some of the features. That kind of flexibility, I think it's crucial to have to run really good projects. That was what I was planning to go through today. So I'll move over to the questions part. And how this will work is if you have any questions on what I went through here now, then please type them in the chat. And then Luciani will forward those questions to me, as I cannot see them on my screen.
Thank you so much, Christoffer. Gosh, I feel like the last hour has flown. Okay, so we have a question from Oshadi. What would you say is a good level of detail of user stories? So how detailed should they be so that you avoid getting into too much definition, but also that you have enough details to avoid any misunderstandings?
Yeah. Usually when you listen to people that talk about processes, they have a tendency to say that it depends a lot. And unfortunately, I have to sort of resort a little bit back to that as well when answering this. It depends a little bit. I think you should have enough level of details in your user stories so that you can execute in a good way, that it's clear enough for the developers to have 70-80% of the sort of understanding of what needs to be done, but always you have to be humble for that. It will need, as I said, some discussions on top of that to sort of clear out the last uncertainties. So it depends a little bit, but yeah.
Like a sweet spot. We have a question from Jonas. Thank you for a great presentation, Christoffer. One question. You state that psychological safety is important. Can you exemplify on how to facilitate psychological safety in the team?
Yeah. Very many occasions, I think it is not a big problem, actually. I think it works very well sort of out of the box. People in working in the software industry seem to have that a lot with them. But one thing that I've sort of come to see is that, you know, the better you know people, the more chance you actually have to interact socially. Usually the people open up, and it's natural human nature, so that they dare to joke a little bit with each other and so on. If you have a travel budget, for instance, if you can everybody meet in the beginning of a project to sort of go out and eat together, and you have the chance to socialize outside a little bit, that I think it's a really good way to open up the sort of agenda, the sort of arena in the team to be able to facilitate psychological safety. But in other cases, it could be, for instance, that you organize an online fika or something like that. Then also, I mean, as manager, as project manager, or as line manager, or being sort of responsible for interacting with customers primarily, then at times you have to sort of take individual discussions, that, okay, if this kind of feedback is brought up, or these suggestions, you have to sort of you have to sort of be polite when you answer to that with certain persons. But I would say that happens very, very rarely. So get to know each other, ensure that the team gets to know each other and have fun, I would say it's the primary answer to this question.
Cool. Tharindu is asking, do you have any advice for managing AI projects? Sometimes we can't clearly define the tasks because some of these can be research-based tasks and scope creep can happen.
That was a really good question, I would say. I have, to be honest, I haven't been running that many AI projects myself. In general, when it comes to uncertainty exists in all projects, I think. So what you can do is you see, okay, how can we split this problem up into minor chunks, basically? Can we do, okay, we know that this is a complex problem, we need to solve it. Okay, can we do like one part of this AI model first, and can we test run that a little bit? Can we say, okay, we take 1 week or a half a sprint or something like that, and then we focus on that, and based on those findings, then we continue to plan and work a little bit iteratively. I would say that that's on a sort of high level how to approach it.
Sorry. I have a question from Sachit, which is, in your experience, how do you deal with customers who have unrealistic expectations?
Yeah,
that would probably be a whole other
that's a really good question. Honesty, I think in many cases, saying that, this is what you want to have done. Then often there is a discussion. Sometimes you come into the project, or it happens quite often that you think, okay, we should do all of this. So the first discussion I usually have, okay, but if we just deliver this first, we prioritize and deliver this first, then I think it will add value to you sooner. But then in the end of the day, saying that, well, I hear that you say that you think that this will take 2 weeks, but the collective development team, they think that this is a 2 months work. I'm sorry, but we cannot deliver this in 2 weeks. It usually comes to that, But of course, try to explain a little bit. It could be that the customer have missed some important aspects of this is what we need to do, and we also need to do this. Yeah.
I have a question from Magnus. Do you think it makes sense sometimes to first do a lower priority task than a high one, if that means you can continue working with similar things you are already working with, instead of switching focus to a high priority task? Would that increase the total productivity of that specific developer?
Yes, I think when it comes to priority, often you sort of, and even I here in this presentation, I market this as sort of, okay, it's the business priority that that you should always consider, and the sort of the top priority, that sort of top giver for priority, that I would say is the business, what is prioritized for the business. But practically, what's often being prioritized and how you do prioritization, when you change prioritization, you often use feasibility as well. For instance, if we do this build pipeline, customer doesn't care about the build pipeline, but that means that we can release on a third of the time as we otherwise would. Then the build pipeline, it might be prioritized very early on in the project. And likewise, if there is some task that either can increase productivity, or that we can actually, okay, if you just do this small task, then we actually can release this as a whole feature out to the customer, etc. There are several considerations for things that might not in itself be that important for why they actually raise in priority from a feasibility perspective.
Thank you. I have a question from Delisha. Great insights. Regarding fixed price projects, could you explain more on what we can do to increase the flexibility of such contracts during the negotiation phase? For example, clients such as startups are very careful on their budget as well as time to market with the pressure from their stakeholders.
It is difficult. It's a difficulty that I'm facing also and involved in. So it is difficult. What I think this a lot boils down to is trust. So perhaps in the sort of the pragmatical way to approach this is that when you start up with a new customer, you might accept the fact that, okay, you'll take on a fixed price project, and you do it as a fixed price project, the first one. But sometimes here, when they see, okay, these are really good people, they deliver what they committed to, and this is going fast, and we're paying, that you then perhaps try to roll it over, that's saying, for the next project, the follow-up project, then we think it much more efficient that we work like that, because often the pain point arises that, okay, well, you said that you wanted to change this in the middle of the project, but this was a bit problematic for us both since we had a fixed price project. Isn't it better that we allow for that flexibility in the projects that we do going forward? And usually customer, and especially more experienced customer, there is something to that. They realize that as well. But then, as I said, the estimates that you give, they have to be accurate to sort of build the trust of the customer, of course, to be able to continue that way.
I have a question from Anna. What is your advice on how to ensure required technical improvements get prioritized together with improvements that bring business value?
That's also a good question. In general, I think that the technical improvements that the team raises, sometimes they are small and then they are easy to prioritize. For instance, when we hand over to QA, we should think about this and this, or we should sort of we should ensure that this is done before we hand over. Those small things that you prioritize, those you can take without much fuss. If there is a bigger technical development that you need to prioritize, then what I've done a few times is that I actually take them to the customer, saying that, yes, we know that this will impact our ability to deliver functionally in the next sprint. But by doing this investment, getting back to the example of the build pipeline, we actually see that we will be able to deliver much faster with higher quality. So thereby explaining the business value of this technical improvement to the customer, so that they also are okay to pay for it and improve it.
Awesome. Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask? I think we might be finished.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Christoffer.
Thank you so much, everybody, for listening into this session and joining this meeting. Have a nice continued day, everybody. Goodbye.
Everybody.